All right, we're about to crack open one of the most famous poems of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And we're going to uncover a secret that's been hiding in plain sight for 100 years. It turns out this isn't just a story of war. It's the story of a forgotten pandemic.
And it all really starts with this one big mystery. I mean, think about it. Our cities, our towns, they're filled with monuments to soldiers, memorials for the sacrifices of war. But where are the monuments for the millions who died in the 1918 Spanish flu, or any pandemic, for that matter? It's a really strange kind of cultural forgetting.
So why the silence? Well, it seems to come down to how we frame these things. War, we're told, is a collective story. It's a public sacrifice that's supposed to have some kind of meaning. But a pandemic, that's a deeply personal, individual battle. It's an invisible fight inside your own body. There's no heroic narrative there, just senseless, isolated tragedy. And that is so much harder to memorialize.
Okay, so let's wind the clock back to 1922. Europe is just shattered, still reeling from the absolute trauma of the Great War. And into this landscape of total disillusionment, a poem lands that will pretty much define the entire era. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland.
For a century, lines like this one have been read as a direct response to the war. That fear in a handful of dust, well, that had to be the fear of shell-shocked soldiers, of a civilization just blown to pieces. And honestly, that makes a ton of sense. The war was a defining catastrophe.
But here's the big question, the one we're digging into today. What if that's not the whole story? What if there's another ghost haunting these pages? An invisible killer that was every bit as deadly as the war, but was somehow silenced by history? What if this poem is secretly encoded with the experience of the 1918 Spanish flu?
To figure this out, we have to play detective and follow the clues. And that starts with the poet himself. Is there any biographical evidence that connects T.S. Eliot directly to this virus?
Well, the timeline is pretty stark. In December 1918, right at the peak of the pandemic's deadliest wave, both Eliot and his wife Vivian get sick with the flu. And this illness, piled on top of years of personal struggle, it leads to a complete nervous breakdown in 1921. And that's the exact moment he's putting the finishing touches on the poem. The overlap is just, it's impossible to ignore. And then we get this. This is the smoking gun, right here. In his own letters, Eliot connects his suffering directly to the virus. And listen to how he phrases it. He doesn't just call it an illness. He calls it a long epidemic, which suggests it wasn't just a physical sickness for him. It was this all-encompassing atmosphere of contagion and collapse that defined his entire world. Okay, so here's how we're going to break down the evidence from here. We're going to look at this in two parts. First, we'll scan the poem's language for signs of the acute infection, the outbreak itself. And then we'll search for those lingering psychological scars, the aftermath.
All right, let's dive right into the text. Can we actually diagnose the poem with the very symptoms of the flu?
To do that, we have to talk about a key medical symptom, delirium. If you've ever had a really nasty high fever, you know exactly what this feels like. Your mind just becomes this chaotic, confusing, and pretty terrifying place. We're going to use this idea as a lens to understand the poem's style. And when you do that, the poem's famous difficulty suddenly makes a different kind of sense. For years, critics just called it modernist fragmentation. But look at these characteristics. They're not just artistic choices. They are a perfect description of a fever dream. The poem seems to operate on what you could call delirium logic.
The evidence is right there, embedded in the text. Take this line. Now, the traditional reading is that it's about spiritual passion, maybe lust. But if you put on that pandemic lens, it becomes brutally literal. This is the physical sensation of a body on fire with fever.
Or how about this moment? The desperate, broken repetition. It totally captures that overwhelming thirst that came with the flu's high fevers. But it's more than that. The language itself is falling apart. It's disintegrating into just sound. This sounds like the voice of someone whose body is so ravaged by illness they can barely form a coherent thought.
So that's the sickness itself. But what about the aftermath? What happens to the world and to the mind after the fever finally breaks, but the trauma is still there? There's this one key feeling that many pandemic survivors talked about, innervation. And this isn't just being tired, it's this profound state of exhaustion, physical, mental, spiritual. It's like a kind of living death, and that feeling just saturates this entire poem.
The poem is famously full of corpses and bones, and yet traditionally we see these as the bodies of soldiers rotting in the trenches in France.
And that reading is still totally valid. But what if we look a little closer to home?
These images could just as easily be about the civilian dead of the pandemic. See, unlike war casualties, these bodies weren't overseas in some foreign field. They were piling up in cities, in hospitals, in people's homes. This reading doesn't erase the war, it adds to it. It shows how the trauma of the home front was just as horrifying as the battlefield.
Okay, so why does digging up this 100-year-old literary secret even matter today? Well, because we have all just lived through our own pandemic, and this whole thing suddenly feels very familiar.
You know, in the end, reading The Wasteland through a viral lens doesn't cancel out any of the other interpretations. It actually enriches them. It reveals that the poem is really a record of overlapping traumas, of war and pandemic, and that together they forge this modern sense of disillusionment.
And that brings the whole question right back to us, doesn't it? Will our artists and writers create memorials to what we've all been through? Or will our experience become just another ghost, silenced and hidden inside the art of tomorrow, waiting for someone 100 years from now to discover it?
The ultimate takeaway here is pretty powerful. This reading of The Wasteland is a huge reminder that what gets silenced in history can be every bit as haunting as what gets memorialized. The ghosts that are never named are often the ones that haunt us the most. And it really makes you wonder, what other hidden stories are out there, waiting to be found in the art we think we know so well?